Thank you for the invitation. It's, I think this is the third or fourth time I've been back at Stanford to give a talk in my academic career. It's always a tremendous honor and pleasure to go back to my alma mater, although I've got to admit, I increasingly don't recognize the place with all of the new building, but I recognize the quad. Sort of, I know how to get to the inner quad, and then from there everything else follows. What I'm going to be doing, this is a formal paper that's based on an article, or a book chapter actually, that I just wrote. And it provides part of the thematic, the undergirding, for the short biography of Herzl that I'm writing now. And writing about Herzl does present some challenges because of the sheer amount of material written about him, but I'll address that as well as the substantive topic. And I should just mention that the OU is not just British spelling, it's Canadian, and after 20 years in Canada, it's very hard to, I actually like it, you know, Kalur. Okay. So I'm talking today about a life project. What do I mean by that? A life project is a set of goals or practices that endow a person's life with meaning and direction. A life project is more specific, but also more all-encompassing than careerist ambition or a desire to accumulate wealth and objects or a yearning for personal fulfillment through romantic relationships. A life project transcends these pedestrian aspirations in its devotion to a cause, belief, or ideology, and yet it's nourished by the same psychological needs that underlie all human behavior. From the mid-1890s, Zionism became Theodor Herzl's life project. At this time, Zionism became the latest manifestation of Herzl's ongoing project to attain both honor and authenticity. Now, these two concepts, honor and authenticity, overlap, yet they are distinct and at times contradictory. Honor refers to a sensibility that self-worth depends upon following a certain code of behavior, even if it's not convenient or personally beneficial to do so. Honor is usually associated with qualities such as resolve, courage, self-sacrifice, and loyalty. Honor is also often associated with honesty and fair play, as in gaming or sport. But codes of honor could demand reticence, holding one's tongue, even outright dissemblance, so long as the behavior is altruistic. Simply put, honor does not demand a constant, unremitting display of transparency towards others. Nor does honor demand, necessarily, authenticity. Now, authenticity is a fraught term with deep philosophical roots in the thought of, among others, Kierkegaard, Nietzsche, and Sartre, and it is especially tempting to relate Herzl to his contemporary Nietzsche's concept of authenticity, Echtheit. Zwischen Ehre und Echtheit, the title of this talk actually sounds better in German. Direct evidence of Nietzschean influence on Herzl, however, is scant. And I can go, there is a whole debate about whether Herzl was a Nietzschean or not, but rather than proclaim Herzl to be a Nietzschean, I would place both men within a broad swathe of fin de siècle Central European writers who championed self-awareness and purposefulness, in Nietzsche's felicitous phrase, to become what you already are. As we shall see, as difficult as it was for Herzl to perceive himself as a man of honor, it was even more difficult, even impossible, for him to achieve authenticity. The very act of striving towards these two affective states fueled his Zionist passion and sustained him during the 9 years during which he irrevocably transformed the Jewish world. Now, the study of Herzl's life, or in particular, as I'm doing today, his affective state, is both enriched and challenged by the vast corpus of Herzl's writings. In addition to hundreds of pieces published in his own lifetime, Herzl kept a diary between 1882 and 1885. It was called now his youth diary, his Jugendtagebuch, and some 6,000 letters written by Herzl over the course of his life have survived. The diary and letters were published in a 7-volume German critical edition in the 1980s and 90s. The most commonly cited source by Herzl's biographers has been what Herzl called his Zionist Diaries, the Zionistische Tagebücher, composed between 1895 and 1904 when he died. And several abridged versions of the diaries have been published, and a complete English language version was made available as early as 1960. Now, these diaries, these Zionist diaries, begin with a brief autobiographical sketch and contains some highly revealing passages from June of 1895, when Herzl experienced a manic episode during which he wrote hundreds of pages, some of it lucid and brilliant, some of it quite mad, and out of which came much of the text of his famous pamphlet of 1896, Der Judenstaat. The Zionist Diaries constitute an odd mixture of public and private text, out of which, private and public text, on the one hand, an expression of Herzl's innermost feelings, with flashes of self-awareness and revealing passages of internal dialogue. On the other hand, they are a record of his self-presentations, planned, performed to the world. In the very first entry of 1895, Herzl writes of, quote, "the honesty inherent in this diary, which would be completely worthless if I played the hypocrite with myself." And yet, from early on, he considered publishing the diaries as a record of, quote, "what I have had to put up with, who have been the enemies of my plan, and on the other hand, who stood by me." So he's already settling scores in this planned future expose. Now, the scholar Shlomo Avineri, who has also written recently on Herzl, has called the diaries a Bildungsroman, an account of encounters with the world, a passage from innocence to experience and from fantasy to pragmatism. I wouldn't agree. The diaries are more superficial than a Bildungsroman or a classic autobiography, which Marcus Mosley, a name well known to I think all of you here, given his being a student, got a PhD here, Marcus Mosley, in his definitive study of modern Jewish life writing, nicely describes the Bildungsroman as a study in the self's becoming and fashioning. Autobiography privileges perception and feeling over action. Childhood receives disproportionate attention as the time when the self and the relationship between self and world are established. Herzl's diaries, on the other hand, do not tell the story of his personal formation. They are an account of action in real time. Nonetheless, if they're read critically and carefully alongside of other writings by Herzl, they can serve as points of confirmation and contrast, a useful lens through which to ascertain Herzl's psychological state and emotional conditions, especially given the diary's generous helpings of self-aggrandizement, depression, hypochondriasis, and self-pity. In this sense, the diaries maintain the spirit of that pioneer of life writing, Jean-Jacques Rousseau, whose confessions proclaim, quote, "I suffered before I learned to think." Now, unlike other biographers of Herzl, my own work in progress situates Herzl as a Zionist leader by drawing on scholarly literature on leadership, charisma, and the psychology of political leaders. Now, I've published elsewhere on Herzl's charisma as a relational construct that depends as much upon the social context in which a charismatic leader lives as on the individual herself. Here, I want to focus on Herzl's interiority, in particular the striving of this deeply troubled individual to construct a stable persona with a will to live and to engage the world. Most of Herzl's biographers focus on Herzl's troubled relationship with his Jewishness, encounters with anti-Semitism, which were hurtful and humiliating, the sense of humiliation and shame which catalyzed an internalization of anti-Semitism and a harsh critique of his fellow Jews. My approach is a bit different. I think that the psychic origins of Herzl's life project lay not in Jewishness or in anti-Semitism as such, or certainly not in them alone. Anterior to Herzl's construction of the Jews and his own Jewish self-ascription was an unresolved struggle to find meaning in life, to win recognition, which was the only means to relieve his chronic and powerful depression. Herzl was a darkly unhappy man, given to the blackest of moods. Although he never seriously planned to end his own life, he did suffer from bouts of depression. At 19, again at 23, when his theatrical career appeared stalled, his love life was in tatters, and he had resigned from his student fraternity due to its increasing anti-Semitism. The turn to Zionism, taken to give his life meaning and purpose, offered no immediate cure to Herzl's fundamental ailment. Herzl fell into a funk again in 1896, when after only a few months of Zionist activity, he had not yet attained a charter from the Ottoman Sultan. In the same year, 1896, Herzl published a feuilleton about an unhappily married man, Herzl himself was unhappily married, more on that in a moment, on the verge of drowning himself, but who was saved thanks to a chance encounter with an eccentric inventor. Inventors show up a lot in Herzl's fiction. The inventor tells the miserable would-be suicide, despair is a precious substance from which the most wonderful things can be generated. Courage, self-denial, resolution, sacrifice. To the stubbornest man, I recommend self-realization in a great task. They have achieved the most. As I look back in the past, it seems to me that all of the great men of history were once at the river's edge and turned back so that their despair bore fruit. All discoverers, prophets, heroes, statesmen, artists, yes, all philosophers also, because one never philosophizes better than when staring death in the face. Depression and the determination to overcome it has indeed been common among great leaders, and there are intriguing parallels on this point between Herzl and Winston Churchill, whose psyche was trenchantly analyzed by Anthony Storr in his classic essay, Churchill's Black Dog of 1989. According to Storr, had Churchill, and I'm quoting, been a stable and equable man, he would never have inspired the nation. Churchill's triumphant moment in 1940, like Herzl's in 1896, was made possible only because, quote, all his life he had conducted a battle with his own despair that made it possible to convey to others that despair could be overcome, end quote. Churchill's novel of 1897, Savrola, begins almost identically to Herzl's Altneuland, with a 30-something man steeped in melancholy, overcome by work, worry, jaded, nervous, and emotionally enervated. As a young man, Churchill and Herzl alike had been consumed by shame. For Churchill, it was his boyhood frailty and cowardice. For young Herzl, his rejection from medical service on medical grounds, also contraction of gonorrhea from a prostitute, and the evasion of fighting duels while a university student. Both men catapulted between self-deprecation and self-aggrandizement. Herzl wrote very much in a Herzlian mode when he claimed, "We are all worms, but I am a glowworm." Both men were preoccupied by thoughts of death, and both were hypochondriac. For these men, the aspiration to political leadership stems from something deeper than ambition or power or material gain. The belief in one's heroic mission is a means of fulfilling deep-seated psychic needs. And it was precisely because Herzl and Churchill were not balanced or rational men that they could inspire the public in a time of crisis. A crisis that corresponded externally with the internal, perpetual sense of imminent catastrophe with which they lived on a daily basis. Neither Herzl nor Churchill was warm, had the common touch, or spoke easily and informally. But psychically, Herzl was in fact more fragile than Churchill. He was a desperately lonely man, stuck in a catastrophic marriage to a woman even more mentally unbalanced than he. Herzl had some youthful, rather mechanical dalliances, and he appears to have felt a volcanic, albeit ephemeral, erotic attraction to his wife Julie, whose kisses set him afire when the two first met in 1886, and who gave birth to their first child scarcely 8 months after the wedding. Yet the marriage to Julie quickly soured, and after that Herzl never found, or apparently sought, sexual satisfaction with individuals of either gender. He was too narcissistic to be capable of mature conjugal love, or even of sustained platonic friendship. His only true friend, the journalist Heinrich Kahne, committed suicide in 1891. Tellingly, when Herzl received the news of Kahne's suicide, he abandoned Julie, who was 5 months pregnant, and decamped for Italy and France, returning to Vienna only during the final weeks of the pregnancy, and then fleeing again to Spain 2 months after his son Hans was born. It was on these misery-induced European trips that Herzl wrote some of his finest travel feuilletons, which caught the eyes of the editors of the Neue Freie Presse and won him the position as that newspaper's Paris correspondent. It's not surprising that peripatetic and broken-hearted men litter his novel Altneuland. The protagonist, Herzl's alter ego, Friedrich Lowenberg, the crusty Prussian aristocrat Kingscourt, and even Kingscourt's Tahitian servant have all loved and lost. And now they prefer to seek the companionship of men, circumnavigating the globe by ship, sojourning for decades on an isolated South Pacific island. Loneliness was a source and product of Herzl's melancholy temper, but shame drove him to seek honor. Shame over what he perceived as physical weakness and cowardice led Herzl to exalt allegedly Prussian aristocratic values, such as manliness, stolidity, strength of character, self-discipline, direct speech, and decisiveness. Herzl juxtaposed these qualities against those of Jews, who even in Herzl's most mature writings are often depicted in stereotypical, even anti-Semitic terms, as crass and venal, for example. Herzl was wont to portray Jewish women in a particularly grotesque way, as bedecked with jewels and displaying fallen décolletage. Herzl's finest play, The New Ghetto, of 1894, is filled with unpleasant Jewish characters, but also features a corrupt aristocratic mine owner who at the play's end fights a duel with and kills the Jewish character, the hero, Jacob Samuel, clearly an alter ego for Herzl. Jacob was Herzl's father's name. Jacob has come by the play's end to realize that it is dishonorable to assimilate into Christian society, and that Jews must learn how to, in Jacob's words, bow without subservience and stand tall without truculence. Paradoxically, Herzl's yearnings to behave with honor led him to exempt himself from an infamous proposal of 1893 that Jews undergo mass conversion to Christianity to put an end to anti-Semitism. Herzl saw himself as remaining Jewish out of what he called filial loyalty and manly pride. To invoke terminology later made famous by Hannah Arendt, Herzl would always be the proud pariah and never the parvenu. The sense of being a pariah caused Herzl to identify with the hapless Captain Alfred Dreyfus. Now, at the time of Dreyfus's first trial, Herzl wrote little of the matter. He did not protest the verdict. He did not assume Dreyfus's innocence. By 1899, Herzl had changed his tune. As my colleague from the University of Toronto, Jacques Kornberg, wrote in a book 20 years ago, and which seems still to have not penetrated popular memory, although it should, Herzl invented in 1899 a conversion to Zionism caused by the Dreyfus affair that inaccurately placed the writing of his play, The New Ghetto, as having occurred after the Dreyfus trial. It's not true. He finished the play beforehand. It is possible to read Herzl's volte-face as a canny act of self-invention at a time when the Dreyfus trial had ballooned into the Dreyfus affair, Émile Zola's J'accuse had galvanized the world, and the fortunes of Zionism stood to benefit if the movement's leader could claim to have foreseen the tragic import of the arrest, show trial, and brutal punishment of the hapless army officer for his Jewish faith. But Herzl clearly identified with Dreyfus's love of the state and sense of duty. He claimed that any Jew who would advance so far as to become an officer on the general staff, and as an aside, I should mention Dreyfus was not the first officer of Jewish origin on the general staff. There, in fact, had been several others, but that's another book. Herzl writes it was psychologically impossible, writing as much about Herzl's own ambitions to be a military officer as about Dreyfus. Herzl wrote, because the Jews were deprived of the honors of citizenship for so long, the Jews have a desire for honor that frequently borders on the pathological, and a Jewish army officer is a Jew, raised to the nth degree. Now, Herzlian Zionism did aspire to restore Jews to their ancient homeland, but Herzl, in fact, envisioned a thriving diaspora that would coexist alongside a future Jewish state. The Jewish state's very existence would endow Jews the world over with a sense of honor, and once the state were in place, Jews would be respected by Gentiles as normal people, grounded in a territory that to the Jews' greater credit would be developed in an exemplary fashion and seen, in Herzl's words, later quite controversial words, as a rampart of Europe against Asia, an outpost of civilization against barbarism. Herzl believed that Jews would no longer be rootless cosmopolitans whose exceptionalities stimulated the formation of chronic and ultimate destructive anxiety. This was simply what Pinsker had also written famously in 1882 in Auto-Emancipation about the Jews as a Spukvolk, a ghost people. Now, this emerges in 1902 when Herzl testified before the Royal Commission on Alien Immigration. He made it clear that his Zionist program would leave plenty of room for Jews to stay in place. He was asked, did he demand that every Jew leave England or even Europe? And Herzl said, no, you must leave that to every man for himself. He must decide whether he will assimilate or not, whether he will go to another nation or assimilate. I say it's not right to influence a man to do it, except by putting arguments before him and letting the forces of nature work. Now, on one level, Herzl here is referring to the right of all free humans to choose where they wish to live. But the full meaning of this quotation emerges only when we compare it to a key theme in the novel Altneuland, published in the year of the testimony. In this novel, poor and persecuted Jews have moved to the utopian society that Herzl sketches out. And yet the very act of moving has caused Gentiles to appreciate Jews to the point that they beg the Jews not to leave. Once the new society of Palestine has been created, Jews in diaspora can stay abroad, or if they wish, they can convert to Christianity, doing so out of pure belief with no instrumental intent. Jews in Herzl's Altneuland no longer have to act out of opportunism. They're endowed with complete freedom, including the freedom to stay put in the diaspora. So it's a very interesting Zionist vision in which he has absolutely no compunctions whatsoever about an ongoing, thriving diaspora. Now, one of the last scenes in Altneuland, perhaps the most momentous, takes place in Jerusalem on the Sabbath eve in the rebuilt temple, which sort of resembles the Stephansdom in Vienna. Anyway, in the rebuilt temple, where the novel's hero, Friedrich Lohenberg, reflects upon Jewish honor. So he's musing to himself as he listens to the choir. He recalls the time, and I'm quoting from the novel, when the Jews had been ashamed of everything that was Jewish, when they believed they looked more aristocratic when they hid their Jewishness. By this, is there any wonder they were despised if they despised themselves? They had crawled after strangers, and they were rightly repulsed. But now Friedrich looked around him and saw the strong, the free, the successful, who received more than they gave, and suddenly, in a flash, he understood the meaning of the temple. Only here had the Jews now restored a free commonwealth. In the ghetto, they were without honor or rights or justice or defense. And when they left the ghetto, they ceased to be Jews. But now, only now, when the Jews had both freedom and community, could they rebuild the house of the invisible and almighty God. Now, this reference to religion happens in the very last sentence of the novel, where a venerable rabbi invokes God as the source of the Jews' salvation. Now, this is a melodramatic flourish. Herzl was not a believer, and his writings often featured a strong anti-clericalism. Yet his anti-clericalism went hand in hand with a secularized religiosity, not only because of a typical Viennese love of ritual and ceremony, but because the very essence of Jewishness, in Herzl's opinion, lay in their origins in a religious community. As Herzl wrote, "Wir erkennen uns als Nation am Glauben." We recognize ourselves as a nation through belief. Religion was a container, not a content, a carrier wave, not a signal. And so Herzl drew a distinction between the hypocrisy of organized religion, embodied in the novel's villain, the xenophobic Rabbi Geyer, and the shared history of Jews as a religious community, as we saw in 1893, the denial of which would be an act of supreme dishonor. Altneuland, as those of you know who have read it, is not a fun novel to read. It's filled with long monologues that closely resemble theatrical soliloquies, but that's no surprise, given that Herzl was a dramaturg. Herzl would read the entire scripts of his plays to prospective producers, directors, and cast members. They didn't have the internet. And so he would read lengthy memoranda or the entire pamphlet, The Jewish State, to potential supporters, which might explain why he had so few. Herzl saw nothing dishonorable about performance, as long as the motives were sincere. So Herzl wrote a play in 1895, one of his lesser-known plays, Die Glosse, about one Philippus of Monteperto, a lawyer in 13th century Bologna, who wins back his adulterous wife by dramatically reciting to her a Roman marriage code. In Altneuland, the act of recitation also has a salvific power. The engineering and managerial expert Joe Levy proclaims the technological wonders of the new society via a gramophone recording played at a Passover Seder. Like the Haggadah, the recitation is long and rather tedious, and yet absolutely central to a narrative of Jewish enslavement and redemption. There is no contradiction between performance and honor. Rituals by which honor is asserted or reaffirmed are performative acts. As Herzl wrote to Kana in 1883, he's a young man, 23 years old. It's a great quote. It seems you have not understood or found the key to my character, perhaps because I make a show of presenting myself as wide open. I do not often speak the truth, but I'm a sincere animal, and if I do often lie, I never do so if there's no advantage in it. Being true to oneself does not necessarily demand transparency and absolute truthfulness to the world, but there is a fine line between maintaining duality between internal and external self-representation in order to preserve your honor and simply lying to others to promote self-interest. Sincerity and hypocrisy were key elements in much of Herzl's journalistic writings. The title of Herzl's feuilleton collection, The Book of Folly, Das Buch der Narrheit, 1888, is taken from the epigram at the beginning of Jonathan Swift's Tale of a Tub, the serene and peaceful state of being a fool among knaves. Another feuilleton collection, luridly titled News from Venus, it was censored for that reason, although there was nothing in the, but anyway, Neues von der Venus, begins with the epigram, all men are at the start good, or as I call it, genuine. And then something happens, perhaps but the lapse of time, and they all become shams. Criticism of social norms and the exposure of hypocrisy were staples of the era's literature. Consider the psychologically fraught plays of Henrik Ibsen or the thunderous polemics of Max Nordau. This critique takes a rather simplistic form in Herzl's stories, such as The Mind Reader, 1887, a story about a man who can read minds and therefore is exposed to the falseness, the falsehood of human, behind human actions. Another short story called A Good Deed talks about the often impure motives behind beneficial actions. His comedies were, as was typical of the genre and the era, filled with deceivers who themselves are deceived. But this plot device takes on a particularly dark tone in Altneuland, where Miriam Litwak, a virtuous woman and the incarnation of Herzl's deceased sister, Pauline, quotes Goethe, "Crucify every dreamer who reaches his 30th year." Once he has known the world, the deceived becomes the deceiver. Now, the epigram may have been a highly irreverent reference to Jesus, but Herzl may have believed it spoke to him, to himself, and his own feelings of guilt about his own inauthenticity, which I'll talk about now. From childhood, Herzl's affect was aloof, poised, and defensive, characteristics intensified during his adolescence by an unrequited schoolboy crush on a girl named Madeline Hertz, the daughter of family acquaintances, but also, more so, by his sister's death in 1878. Pauline's death devastated Herzl, yet he kept the feelings private, and in his autobiographical sketch of 1898, he makes no references to his own grief and only talks about his mother's grief causing the family to move from Budapest to Vienna. Now, some level of concealment or displacement of personal feeling is to be expected in any kind of public life writing. But this statement, could be seen as not terribly surprising, any more than his misrepresentations about the Dreyfus trial, or his claim, a lie, in 1898 that he left a pleasant job as a state attorney in Salzburg out of a realization that as a Jew he would never be promoted to the judiciary. That's not true. He resigned as soon as he could after 1 year of service because he wanted to pursue his theatrical career. Okay, so politicians make stuff up. That's not, even in the United States, politicians make stuff up. Fine. Authenticity can survive a bit of creative storytelling, but it does demand a high level of self-awareness. And in this regard, Herzl was lacking. Herzl was unaware, apparently, that he developed a posthumous love for his sister that fused fraternal and erotic elements, so much so that in Altneuland, his alter ego, Friedrich Lowenberg, marries the virtuous Miriam. In other words, Herzl marries his own sister. Herzl did not find anything untoward about a romantic infatuation he developed at the age of 26 with Madeline Hertz's 14-year-old niece, whom Herzl had held in his arms as an infant. Madeline herself had died tragically 2 years before Pauline. Shortly after this brief infatuation with the 14-year-old girl at an ice skating rink, it's a very strange story, Herzl met the beautiful 18-year-old Julie Naschauer, with whom he exchanged flirtatious kisses that aroused his desire, but also an inexplicable, he did not understand what was happening to him, feeling of self-disgust and self-hatred, which he described as a wild nausea that drove him to consider suicide. Torn between eros, repulsion, and fear of sexual maturity and marital responsibility, Herzl ran away from Vienna and traveled for several months, tormented by psychosomatic pain. It was 3 years later, with some theatrical and journalistic success under his belt and perhaps feeling a bit more assured of his masculinity, that Herzl returned to Julie. They married, but then there was the cycle repeated itself of a feeling of insecurity, psychological crisis, leaving his wife, traveling. It was something that characterized his life. In his youth, Herzl had been frank, even ribald, in writings to his friend Kana about his sexual encounters. There's more than a touch of adolescent boasting in these writings, but what's striking about them is their underlying tone of anxiety. After a particularly graphic comparison of writing a novel with intercourse, and you can look up those of you who read German can go look that up, Herzl concludes, "I'll tell you one thing, and here I'm speaking from personal experience. A love affair and a novel can drain you." Now Herzl would go on to write a novel, a work that would be his greatest solace as his Zionist diplomatic efforts went awry. But he gave up on erotic love, marital or otherwise, and he contented himself with fantasies of virginal and unattainable girls. And these obsessions mar one of his most beautiful and mature stories, Die Brille, The Reading Glasses, 1902. In general, his fiction got much better as he got older. This is an epistolary account to an unknown recipient from a middle-aged man, Herzl, who has acquired his first pair of reading glasses, and he dwells upon their import. He writes, "Reading glasses are the border, the watershed. From here on, the water flows to the other side. One must leave this. The glasses are the official beginning of old age." Sorry, I have to change my glasses. As Herzl puts it, even more bluntly, first we lose our looks, then our passion, and reading is our only remaining pleasure. The character reflects that as we age, our eyes lose the ability to see things at close range, but our distance perception remains sharp, an obvious metaphor for the ability of older people to perceive what really matters in life and ignore ephemera. The composer of this letter is wearing his new lenses while he writes in a hotel salon. He sees, he doesn't see, he perceives a young woman enter the room. Because of the lenses, he cannot see her, but he catches the scent of her perfume. And he hears the rustle of her dress. He abandons all attempt to flirt with her or to hide the glasses in a pretense to conceal his age. These reflections appear mature, but as the story approaches its end, the letter writer notes that this blurry-faced woman in the salon reminds him of the 14-year-old girl he had loved in his youth and who he never got over. It's not clear if Herzl is reminiscing about Madeline Herz or her niece, but in either case he seems to be stuck or hiding in memories rather than embracing the present, which is the opposite of the story's directive. Herzl invented a much more virile hero in another late story, Epaphroditus, which was closely adopted from Plutarch's Life of Sulla. Herzl had an excellent classical education. His Greek and his Latin were flawless, as well as his French. And he had pretty good Italian, too, and English. There's a great scene late in the diaries. He and the King of Italy were in very good terms. And they chat in Italian, so he writes the diary entries in Italian just to sort of show off a bit. And it was just so funny that they got along famously. So anyway, the Life of Sulla is then reordered a bit by Herzl. The Roman dictator Sulla, a real figure, steps down from power to embrace private life, including sensual pleasures. He dies in the arms of his mistress in Herzl's story. There is more than a hint of identification with a charismatic, self-made dictator surrounded by scheming enemies. Herzl's clearly thinking about himself. And wish fulfillment in the beautiful mistress and the death that grants him peace. And Herzl was obsessed with death from his mid-30s onward, his own death. Now, in the story, the mistress is a developed woman, not a nymphette. But Herzl, perhaps still bearing the scars of his relationship with Julie, cannot separate erotic union from destruction. Herzl adds to Plutarch's tale a story in which a centurion upbraids Sulla for walking unarmed in the public square. The centurion sees this behavior as a sign of weakness, but for Sulla, in Herzl's rendering, walking in public unarmed, or as he puts it, exposed, walking exposed is the ultimate sign of masculine strength. This paean to exposure of vulnerability is an interesting contrast to his notorious plea of 1894 to his friend Arthur Schnitzler to submit Herzl's play, The New Ghetto, under a pseudonym because of the author's Jewish origin. At the time, 1894, Herzl had written to Schnitzler that having finished the play, he longed to hide, to go underground. In the special instance of this play, I want to hide my genitals more than ever. But in his journalistic writings and plays, Herzl praised authenticity. Apparently, it was hard for him to achieve it in real life. For Herzl, then, Zionism became a means by which he could expose his genitals, as it were, that is, the uncircumcised penis, by proclaiming attachment to the people that bore that mark. And thanks to Zionism, he could do so with pride and with dignity. In his very first diary entry of 1895, Herzl compares Jews to seals, who after ages of living entirely in the sea have, due to Darwinian selection, come to look like fish. If they go back to dry land, he writes, the fins will turn to feet. Now, leaving aside the implications of this metaphor, seals, in fact, live their lives in water and land, so maybe Jews are meant to live in both the land of Israel and abroad. But leaving that aside, the point is that for Herzl, Zionism provides an opportunity to be authentic. But he can only be authentic by assuming a role, which is the role of the dissimilating Jew. Herzl, by the way, had a somewhat easier time writing with honesty and sophistication and self-awareness about parental love. He wrote much more intelligently, or I would say honestly, about parental love. Several of his feuilletons offer engaging meditations on the brevity of childhood, the wonder of childhood, and as one might expect given the era and the genre in which Herzl was writing, these are newspaper accounts. They could be saccharine, schmaltzy. But Herzl writes with keen insight that goes beyond schmaltz. These are really beautiful pieces that he writes in the late 1890s. But these sentimental feuilletons should not blind us to the fact that Herzl was an absent father whose observations of his children's growth came at distant intervals like time-lapse photography. Herzl's diaries regularly note his son Hans's birthday, but mistake his age. So he was away from home about 9 months out of 12 between 1896 and 1904. But more disturbing than paternal absence or absent-mindedness is the ease with which the feuilletons about childhood cross the line from wistful to melancholy and from melancholy to macabre. So, for example, in one feuilleton, Herzl has a waking nightmare, a very gruesome one, about his daughter's death. In another, stray and pet birds die with regularity and are buried in the garden. And these gloomy Gothic ruminations pale in comparison with the fever dream of the 1895 diary entries about a Herzlian royal dynasty that Herzl envisions for the future Jewish state. He wrote that his father Jacob would be the first senator of the Jewish state. His son Hans would be its first doge. Herzl envisioned a coronation ceremony with cuirassiers, artillery, infantry, I'm quoting Herzl now, marching in gold-studded gala uniforms. The doge himself will wear the badge of shame. He will wear a pointed hat and a yellow badge. Inside the temple, we will wrap a princely cloak about his shoulders and place a crown upon his head. Herzl writes in his diary that the vision of his own son achieving this state of rather perverse grandeur makes Herzl weep. He weeps at the prospect of crowning his own son as doge. As I said at the beginning, Herzl was experiencing a manic episode, and at the time he feared for his own sanity. He wrote that he was unsure whether or not he was losing his mind, but he wrote, "No, as long as I know that 2 + 2 = 4, I am not insane." And he writes 2 + 2 = 4 over and over again, which is a bit worrying. The bond between genius and insanity crops up frequently in Herzl's published writings. As he said in 1895, the imaginations of madmen are much more colorful, wild, majestic, and frightful than those of Shakespeare, or even of Penslar de Terrail, who's rather now a totally forgotten French author, but it meant a lot to him at the time. Now, given his psychological troubles, this calls into question the very issue of authenticity. How could Herzl have a lucid, realistic view of himself, given his delusions of grandeur, or his narcissism, or whatever else one wants to type him? Herzl told his first biographer, Reuven Brainin, that as a child he dreamed of conversing with Moses and being called the Messiah. Now, we don't know if Herzl really had that dream. But even if he didn't, the fact that he tells this story is revealing. But one last point before we move towards the end, which is even if Herzl were considered sane, how do we apply concepts of authenticity, not to mention honor, to a politician? Herzl was fully capable of devious and manipulative behavior, but interestingly enough, there were certain principles he would not compromise. However challenging it may have been for Herzl to achieve authenticity, he did sustain a certain degree of honor even when immersed in backbiting Zionist politics or mutually contradictory negotiations with the great powers of Europe. Herzl did not like to call himself a politician. He refused to take any money as Zionist organization president, precisely for that reason. He rather spent down his father's fortune and his wife's fortune. But he never took money. Now, Herzl was in many ways not statesmanlike. He could not abide criticism from his lieutenants. He did not read A Team of Rivals. He could be petulant, even savage, when dealing with his opponents. Herzl was usually more chivalrous when dealing with adversaries in Eastern Europe, the Hobbeweit Zion and so on. But he could play internal foes against each other, as politicians do. So, for example, he encouraged the founding of the religious Zionist faction, the Mizrahi, as a counterweight to the secular cultural faction headed by Chaim Weizmann. This is what politicians do. Herzl's diplomatic activity was certainly opportunistic. When he began in 1896 to seek the favor of the Ottoman Sultan, Herzl ensured that the Neue Freie Presse, his newspaper, would present the Ottoman government in a favorable light regarding the Armenian question. In his contacts with the Ottomans, Herzl avowed that an imperial charter to settle Jews in Palestine would help the empire maintain its independence and integrity. But at the same time, he courted the European powers, particularly Britain and Germany, one of which he hoped would proclaim a protectorate over Palestine. Now, in international diplomacy, opportunism is hardly dishonorable. And the only difference between Herzl and his interlocutors, the Ottoman Sultan, the German Kaiser, the British Foreign Minister, was that they had more power, and they played the game more effectively than he did. Also, some of Herzl's claims that seemed outrageous at the time were apparently sincere. Herzl appears to have truly believed that he could have formed a syndicate of Jewish bankers who would raise vast loans for the Ottoman Empire and settle its ballooning debt. Herzl also had very clear notions of the limits of colonialism as well as its strengths and benefits. So in Egypt in 1903, Herzl writes that the Egyptians should be grateful to be occupied by the British because they're bringing so much progress to the land. But then he writes a few paragraphs later that he attends a meeting of young Egyptian nationalist youth. He listens to them and writes, these young people could very well bring about the imminent end of British colonialism. So he's not unaware of what's happening. Now, Benny Morris, well-known historian of the Israel-Palestine conflict, has written that if Herzl had had military power, he would have overthrown the Ottoman government and taken Palestine in a military coup. I'm not sure of that at all. At the very beginning of the Zionist writings, 1895-96, Herzl does write privately in a highly bellicose manner. He writes that the Zionists should wait to establish colonies until they have a Jewish army to defend them. And then once the colonies have a critical mass, their army will ensure that they cannot be dislodged. And in 1895, Herzl wrote cursorily, but in a quite controversial statement, that natives of whatever land should become a Jewish state, and he didn't know what it would be, should be spirited away. So what do we make of these crazy statements from his diary written for private consumption in 1895 and 96? Herzl's biographers tend to grant greater weight to his diary entries and letters than his public statements as gauges of his innermost thoughts. And such an approach makes sense. After all, we're more likely to be sincere to ourselves and to our friends than the public. But I think Herzl forms an exception. Many of Herzl's most private remarks were not confessions. They were fantasies. They were the products of an at times unbalanced mind. In public, Herzl literally put himself together. His carefully constructed and measured and calculated statements, made over and over again, were no less authentic than the private cries of a tortured soul. Herzl was psychologically exoskeletal, built from the outside in. And this is why Alt-Neuland is such a central novel. It's a terrible novel. It's melodramatic, it's tedious, but it is a novel that can be criticized as being clumsy, melodramatic, stilted, one-dimensional, Eurocentric, paternalistic, misogynistic, mawkish. Yes, true. It's also entirely sincere. It depicts a community that is not a sovereign state. It has no defined borders. It has no army. And Arabs have not only not been expelled, they have been welcomed into the new society of the future Neuland. So how do we make sense then of a man as riven with contradictions as Herzl? An irrational man who couched his life project in the language of indisputable rational argument, who yearned for honor but was steeped in shame, who saw in Zionism a road to authenticity while having no clear idea where that road would lead. People whose embrace of nationalism stems from deep psychological need, shame, anxiety, inferiority, are liable to become extremist, martial, aggressive. At the outset of his Zionist activity, Herzl started down that road, but he reversed course. Zionism was his life project, but Herzl's needs were entirely internally focused on imagining a Jewish state so he could live comfortably as a European. And thus Herzl sufficed with a disarmingly modest concept of the Jewish nation. This is an interesting comment from 1898. He says, this is what it means to be a Jew. We are noticed. We are a group, a historical group of people who clearly belong together and have common enemy. This seems to be an adequate definition of any nation. I do not think the nation must speak only one language or show any uniform racial characteristics. This quite moderate definition of nationhood is sufficient. We are a historical group of people who clearly belong together and were held together by a common flaw. Herzl's Zionism was a reaction to arrested emancipation and social slights, not pogroms, not existential threat. It was an expression of a search for purpose and a desire to be of consequence. During his first year or two of Zionist activity, Herzl flirted with fantasies of Jewish armed power, but after that he invariably spoke in a softer political register, as he said at the beginning of the Second Zionist Congress in 1898. If there is such a thing as a legitimate claim to any piece of the earth's surface, then all the peoples who believe in the Bible must recognize the rights of the Jews. And they can do so without envy or concern, for the Jews are not a political power, and they never will be one again. Interesting comment for the founder of political Zionism. The Jews will never be a political power again. He later added, the land cannot and never will become the property of any single great power, for it is the best guarded land of all. It is carefully guarded not only by its present proprietor, but by everyone else as well. Herzl's wavering loyalties between the Ottoman Empire, Britain, Germany, did not contradict his firm belief that even under a protectorate, the holy places in Jerusalem must remain under international law. It is ironic that the man who wrote a pamphlet called Der Judenstaat was vague, unsure, and flexible about the form the Jewish polity would take. It could be a sovereign state, a vassal, a satrapy, or an autonomous region. As Herzl said in 1898 in Berlin, what is a state? A big colony. What's a colony? A small state. For Herzl, not only the Jews' antiquity, but also their small size and powerlessness would ensure that the monotheistic world would entrust the Holy Land to the Jews. They will guard and preserve it. Herzl felt supremely satisfied playing this, his favorite role. A good European, entrusted with the most precious terrain in the world, the Terra Sancta. If all Herzl were to achieve was military strength, he would have the honor of a warrior. But that is not what Herzl wanted. He wanted the respect and the trust of his fellow Europeans. Thank you.
Thank you so much for the talk. Really enjoyed it. I am curious because in most conceptions of authenticity, which is something that's bound up really deeply in Protestantism in Europe, it's ahistorical. Mm-hmm. And here Herzl is appealing to a historical sense of authenticity for the Jewish people, something that he sees as essentializing in certain ways. I was wondering if you could talk a little bit more about that potential conflict that he's trying to resolve.
Well, I don't mean a potential conflict. I don't know if he would see it as a conflict, but as he sees the Jews as being historically inauthentic because they have been forced to assimilate and therefore to act in ways that are contrary to whatever their authentic nature is, and that he will restore that authentic state. The irony is not so much for a lot of the people who become his followers. The irony is for Herzl himself, because Herzl has no clear, authentic sense of being Jew. He's not comfortable in his own skin in any way whatsoever. including his Jewishness. So he's inventing an authenticity. But actually what happens is Herzl's message resonates very well with many Jews, for example, in Eastern Europe, because they have a very clear kind of visceral sense of their Jewishness. So it speaks to them. Also, I think it's important never to overestimate Herzl's superficiality. That is, Herzl was not a profound thinker, and the attempts of people like, Jacob Gollum is an intellectual historian who has written, tomes on Herzl as a Nietzschean and Herzl as a this and a that. Herzl owned Nietzsche's books. Well, think of all the books we have in our offices. We haven't necessarily read every single one. Herzl was a journalist, not just by profession, but by temperament. He read quickly, he read superficially, and that's another thing in the biography where I differ from some of the other biographies, is I don't take his political writings seriously as works of political theory. I read them as manifestos, and very effective manifestos, too. So I think that's, for him, if you were to ask him, that's how he would answer the question. Not that he would say he was superficial. But, yeah, Nathan.
Excuse me. Thanks for the talk. Two quick questions. First, obviously this talk brought to mind Karl Schorsky's classic work on Vienna. And I'm wondering, particularly because you were drawing very liberally on many of his plays that some of the biographers really don't take as seriously. What you see the relationship for Herzl between politics and culture?
Right.
And second, a broader sort of writing question. When you write a biography like this, how is that project different from the work that you've done before, and how do you think about it differently?
So that's a tough one. Schorsky published his famous essay on Herzl, von Schöner, and Lueger in 1967. It's been a while. It's a great piece, but it certainly was not the last word. And to put Herzl solidly in a framework of an illiberal, politics of frustration is only partially accurate. So in my own writing, I try to put Herzl you can put him in many frameworks. He's also a product of, very much a liberal politician in terms of the institutions he builds. He also, a lot of his utopian and technological thinking does not really fit well into a kind of illiberal, you can't compare him to Lueger or to von Schöner in that sense. It's clear, though, that for Herzl, politics is a form of theater. That's clear. And the stuff that Schorsky made famous and that we've repeated over again about Herzl's, the choreography of the Zionist congresses and the aesthetics that he brought to the Zionist movement, the flag, the symbolism, the evening dress, all that. Yes. Politics is theater. And more interesting is the psychological confusion in Herzl in 1895, where he does not know if he is writing a novel or a political manifesto. He is in a state of psychological distress, very deep distress in the spring of 1895. And it's just pouring out. And he talks about it as a novel, he talks about it in other language, and only sort of as he emerges from this psychological fog, July, August, September 1895, this becomes a political manifesto, and it eventually becomes Der Judenstaat. But before it's an address. He's going to read a lengthy address to the Rothschilds, and that becomes the Jewish state. So he doesn't even know if what he's doing is a novel or a political tract. And this tension shows up again and again, where he, throughout his Zionist career, whenever things are going bad in terms of his diplomatic work, or he's angry at the Russian Zionists, and he's always angry at the Russian Zionists, he says, I'm going to write a novel. And they're terribly hackneyed plot devices, and they normally involve men who are unhappily married, and they fight some virtuous woman, and he sails off to Palestine. It's like Daniel Deronda without the quality. It's bad stuff. And when he's really in despair, 1899, 1900, about political progress, he starts writing Alt-Neuland. And for him, writing that novel sustained him during 2.5 very difficult years. So here's a politician, a statesman, but what he's doing at home for fun at night is writing Alt-Neuland. So this politics-theater connection, or politics-culture connection, was never really separable. As far as writing biography, I don't know yet, because I've only finished the research, literally this break from Oxford. Now I'm going to start writing. I have a sabbatical term coming up, so I'm going to start writing. I think it's going to be very difficult partly because of the genre. It's a short biography. Partly because it has to be written for a lay audience, so I can't use semicolons. I can't say reification even once. Can't use words like discourse. But also I have to be very concrete. You begin with a story. You begin in medias res, like films, Hollywood films, if you've noticed in the last 20 years, they no longer tell a story from A to B. They begin somewhere in B, then they go back to A, then they go up to D. And so I don't know if I'm going to be quite that fancy, but I'm going to begin with some story. I think it's actually going to begin with him being called to visit the Ottoman Sultan, because I think for him that was the high point of his life. For him, the most important thing, what he called the object of his desire, was Constantinople, not Palestine. So you and I can talk about that. And then I go back. So part of it is framing, and part of it is concrete detail. Clothing, food, weather, description of people's faces and affects and attributes, which we historians, we don't do. People are these sort of abstract figures in our writing. Every year in my European history courses, I give an introductory lecture called Zombies and Ghosts, where I talk about historiography as basically the creation of a collective body of zombies that have no real, there's no real essence to them, as opposed to memory or culture, fiction, which is much more affectively appealing. So it's a challenge, and frankly, see in a year or two if I've been able to do it.
Well, that gives rise to another question, which is, in the act of writing the biography, there's also the question that remains, which is, given all that he is, how does he come to represent so much?
Right.
And to what extent can you put that into the biography, and to what extent can you not put it, because then it also becomes a massive project, because in some ways he is very much a product. If there is any resonance to his name, it's really the kind of movement and the followers and the people who appear to be following, or the taking of his name, the connotation of the whole Herzl, maybe not an imaginary Herzl, of course.
Right.
So, to what extent is an imaginary Herzl part of the Herzl biography? Or will you make it explicitly, no, it wasn't like him, no, this wasn't him, this wasn't him, this wasn't him. Here is, to the best of my ability, what I think this person was like, but then have another section or weave into it what his representation is as well. And so I don't know how you were thinking about that. I would love to know.
Yeah, I mean, I was assuming, I'll ask Steve and Anita when the time comes, I was assuming that some of this stuff would go at the very beginning and at the very end. That obviously there'll be an epilogue where I deal with this sort of stuff. That nationalist movements, there's a great line, I think it was Bertold Feivel, who was one of these early cultural Zionists, who wrote, "We invented Herzl with our longing. Durch unsere Sehnsucht. We invented him." And that will be in the book itself will be a discussion of the dialogic quality of charisma and leadership, that Herzl is very much invented by the circumstances and by his leaders, as by his own attributes. So that'll be sort of running through the book. But then we get to, two things. One is the immediate aftermath, where the Zionist movement coalesces, the institutions he creates take much stronger form. We get to the second Herzl, who is Weizmann, who in many ways is a kind of stronger, he's like Herzl 2.0. This works in Silicon Valley, I can say. Herzl 2.0, bigger, better, stronger, a bit more stable, and shepherds the Zionist movement for 2 decades, more than 2 decades. So we've got that. I'll talk about that for a few pages. But then the extent to which the state of Israel needed this kind of mythological figure, the Prince of Egypt, raised, assimilated, knows the language of Pharaoh's court, discovers his people, dies tragically, never sees the promised land. So we've got the whole Megillah, the whole package right there. And then I will talk a little bit at the end about the different representations of Herzl and how Herzl has changed from this kind of revered, unrealistically, mythologically revered figure in the early years of Israel. Then in the 70s, you began to get Israelis who wrote good biographies of him who began to chip away. because there was this kind of post-founding generation of resentment against mythologization of the past. And I'm actually, to the extent I'm talking about these things, I'm not trying to sort of deconstruct. I'm trying to show, isn't it amazing that a man as pixelated as Herzl was able to do what he did? You know, I'm actually writing, in some ways, celebratory is the wrong word, but it is an admiring book of a man who was able to accomplish so much. But in the later part of the book, I'll then talk about how Herzl now, I think, in Israel has simply disappeared from public memory. There's a great, does anybody remember Hadag Nachash? They were a hip-hop group, and they were big in the, I think they're not so big now. But anyway, they did a great video satire of Herzl. There was an Israeli educational TV show in the, well, TV in Israel, the 70s, called Gabi V'Debi. Any Israelis here who remember Gabi V'Debi? It would teach English. And you had these two kids who traveled through time, and they went to some western town, and so these two, they recreate the old cartoon image of these two kids. They go back in time, like Sherman and Peabody in the Wayback Machine, if anybody remembers the American cartoon. They go back to the Zionist Congress, and there's Herzl with his eyes, his famous, limpid, charismatic eyes, but they say, Hu haya mastur legamre. He was completely stoned. And they realize that Herzl, because they say to Herzl, you know, the country's in terrible shape, we need you, you're our leader. And he's just saying, he gives them an LSD tablet. And he says, Im tikachu en zo agada. If you take the pill, it's no... So, and they realize, oh my God, this man is hu haya mastur legamre. He's totally stoned, he's worthless. And they have to sort of go and rely on themselves. So I'm going to use that in the book to sort of illustrate how Herzl has become you know, a kind of very distant figure. So the answer is, yeah, I have to do it, but it'll be 10, 15 pages towards the end. Yeah.
I wonder if it's not changing now in terms of Israel, the way that Herzl is being perceived. Mm-hmm. And one example that really surprised me was the many graffiti with Herzl in it.
Right.
Like, if you don't want, לא רוצים, לא צריך. If you
right.
know, if you don't want the land, then no. And then reactions to that, and all of them with Herzl's kind of image there. And so I think he's actually coming back.
Good.
Both the word Zionism and Herzl are coming kind of back together.
I think you're right within a certain subculture. For example, because Herzl, I mean, it's part of the whole anti-statist turn that one finds in historiography in this country, Noam Pianko and David Myers, but also in Israel, Dmitry Shumsky and even Israel Bartal have written about these sort of non-statist forms of Zionism. And so there's going to be, and Herzl's part of that. It's ironic that the author of Der Judenstaat is not really, you know, as I ask my students in Oxford to write essays, I write, you know, was Herzl the first post-Zionist? So I think for a certain subculture that can work. On the other hand, we do have an attempt by the state to enforce the older image of Herzl in the Herzl Museum, which has been redone in a kind of sound and light spectacular where they have several different films playing all at once, one of Herzl's early life, one of the Zionist congresses, and it's about an actor. Have you seen this one? It's about a director making a film, doing a play about Herzl. And it begins at the École Militaire, or the École Polytechnique. No, it's the École Militaire. And you've got a couple of French cadets speaking in a villainously French accented Hebrew about how much they hate Dreyfus and they're going to destroy him. And so you've got the classic sort of presentation of Herzl's turn to Zionism, but then Herzl is played by an actor who has no connection with Zionism, no connection with Herzl, and over the course of the hour-long presentation, the director and producer in this fictional play within a play teach the young man. So it's like the young, deracinated generation of post-Zionists will learn what it's like to be Herzl. At the end of this play within a play, the actor playing Herzl puts on the beard and becomes Herzl. To my mind, you know, not terribly well, but so I think there's an attempt to sort of use a kind of a play within a play, self-aware, you know, ironic, performative mode to inculcate an awareness of Herzl by a state institution. And at the end, there's a film about how all of Herzl's vision has been realized through the state of Israel, which is the natural realization of Alt-Neuland. Although they do admit we have a few problems, but you know, you know, I think you're absolutely right, though, and I've seen those, they're like stencils. Yeah, I've seen it.
I think there is a conversation with it, at least. It's not that he is kind of a static figure that, like it was before, but it is, he continues to be part of the conversation as Zionism changes in Israel, or there are discussions on Zionism. Actually, that was a comment. I have a question to ask, if it's okay. The sentence that he yearned for honor but was driven by shame really stayed with me. And I wonder, to what extent do you think that this stayed with Zionism or with other parts of the movement beyond Herzl? Or is it just something that has to do with his own kind of... Is it just you looking at him as a person? Or did it really get into... the movement in general, because there is so much that you can say about the movement in general in terms of honor and shame.
And this gets back to Nathan's question about biography. This is a story about one man. My work until now has been collective. I do a lot of prosopography, sort of group stories. Sure, one of the appeals of the Zionist project across the board was restoring to Jews a sense of agency, and there's a very strong association between agency and masculinity. Very strong sense that the Jewish man had been emasculated by ghetto conditions. It was in Yosef Roth's novel Job, the main character who's he's afraid of dogs, horses, and soldiers. You know, this kind of weak, nebichtik man, afraid to use physical force, afraid to assert honor. And you see this in many different forms in the Zionist project, whether it's the founders of Hashomer, the first Zionist militia in late Ottoman Palestine. The language of classic Zionism is all about empowerment and honor and kavod, and restoring Jewish honor. So I think that sort of runs through the project. On the other hand, I don't know how many people have seriously compared the Zionist project's discourse of honor with that of many nationalist movements of stateless peoples that have felt oppressed, put upon, emasculated, and that through some form of sovereignty and agency, they're restoring a sense of honor and pride. The reason why what I'm thinking of is I'm sort of thinking against Daniel Boyarin's unheroic conduct, whose critique of Herzl certainly has value. It's a fascinating critique, but I think it's a bit unfair because, Herzl, first of all, Herzl doesn't speak for the whole Zionist project, and I think there is more to Herzlian Zionism than just this kind of, sense of emasculation. So yes, I think it's, and you find it, though, there are aspects of Zionism where you don't find it. And does Ahad Am Zionism really have the same sense of shame and honor? Does religious Zionism of the Mizrahi have the same kind of, so it depends on who you're looking at. Yeah, Sophie.
So this is already challenging how I think about my modern Jewish history classes. So given these complicated realities of Herzl, in my sprint of, whatever, where I teach it, it's like the 1400s to present, right. Modern Jewish history.
It's what I call Judaism's greatest hits.
It's fantastic, and I tend to over-rely on the myth of Herzl. Yeah. And that's the one that the students find poignant, and it stays with them. How are we now going to introduce these very complicated realities of Herzl the man, not the myth?
Well, I don't think we have to in an undergraduate lecture course. We always do stylized history. I mean, you and I, we're veterans of Indiana. Remember H-251 and H-252, just rolling through the centuries. So no, I don't think that we don't delve into the latest historiography. There's a difference, though, between being brief and being sort of distorting the evidence. I think it would be perfectly logical to say that Herzl is a product of a fin de siècle Viennese culture that is deeply anti-Semitic, that he was driven to distraction by the election of Karl Lueger as mayor, and by pervasive Austrian anti-Semitism, and that combined with his own, personal yearnings to find meaning in life led him to Zionism. That's one sentence. So I think you don't have to, repeat the myth to simply come up with an equally elegant but more accurate depiction. So, yeah.
You said as an aside he didn't like Russian Zionism. What was that all about?
There's a great line of Menachem Usishkin, who was a brilliant, bull-headed stubborn as can be leader of the Russian Zionists, who wrote to another Russian Zionist, "Herzl is our greatest asset. He has one quality none of us possess. He knows nothing about Jews." The East European Zionists both admired Herzl for his appearance, his charisma, and all of that, but they also could despise him because he was assimilated, he didn't know anything about Judaism, he was completely illiterate Jewishly, and so they saw him both as someone who they admired but whom they hoped to manipulate and who they hoped would get them what they wanted. So there was a certain resentment on their part against him, and sometimes it was pathological. There's a student here who wrote a very good dissertation on Natan Birnbaum, who was a prominent Eastern European Zionist who was Herzl's lieutenant briefly and then left. He couldn't stand Herzl. He just, sorry? It's a book now. I know, a very big book, published by Stanford University Press. There you go. Jess Olson, that's the thing. So they didn't like him. I mean, they admired him. They could love him but not like him, you know what I mean? Or they could admire him but not like him. And then Herzl, in turn, looked down upon these people as uncultured, uncouth, and incapable of thinking in the big picture. So they were thinking, we have to settle Palestine now. We have to send 100 Jews to Palestine now. And he had this grand vision. So Herzl wanted to go directly to the German Kaiser or to, world potentates. He had a great world historical vision. He thought they were petty men, little men. And after all, they spoke Yiddish.
So were they also much more religious?
Not necessarily, no, not necessarily, because within Eastern European Jewry there was often a split. There were those who were Orthodox, often anti-Zionist. A lot of the Eastern European early Zionists weren't Orthodox. They were traditional, they were observant up to a point, but people like Chaim Weizmann, for example, Herzl had an easier time with some of them than many Orthodox Jews. Many Orthodox Jews had a real hard time with people like Chaim Weizmann, because they called for a secular Hebrew culture. So, and Herzl then had a very difficult relationship. He needed the East European Jews. They needed him. Herzl could admire, he would write admiringly of their authenticity. He did write about that. But then he would write all these negative things. But they also looked down upon him as an aretz, as an ignoramus. So it was a very tense relationship. And ultimately, the Uganda crisis would have, I'm convinced that had Herzl not died, within another year or two, I think he would have been thrown out of the movement and he would have become the head of the Jewish Territorialist Organization. I'm not joking, the ITO.
I think we need to end now. But thank you.
Thank you very much.